Hello and welcome to the first video in a series that is going to cover in depth the Accursed Kings Series by Maurice Druon, and I'm going to be starting off this series by reviewing the first book, The Iron King. I will preface this by saying I don't speak French, and if I murder anybody's name, don't kill me in the comments below. I have read most of this series before, however I struggled slightly. It's been translated from French and was written in the 1950s, so is slightly old school in its narrative structure. It was also very hard to find the later books in English in any of my local bookshops. So I have taken the decision that I am finally going to finish the Accursed Kings series, and I am going to review them all here. You're also going to get comparisons with A Song of Ice and Fire, as George R. R. Martin took massive inspiration from this series when creating the A Song of Ice and Fire. He even wrote the foreword for the books in their new variation. This series revolves around King Philip IV of France, also known as Philip the Fair, and his family after his death, and the curse placed on Philip's family and descendants, the whole Capet line, by the Grand Master of the Templars at his burning to death, because the king framed him for heresy, using torture to get a false confession. All the chapters from the Grand Master of the Templars, Jacques de Molay's point of view, are painfully beautiful and exactly the way someone imprisoned and tortured for 7 years might behave when they have nothing to lose and are fighting off solitude-induced madness. The Iron King opens with a point of view from Isabella of France, the most unhappy Queen of England, and her discovery that her sisters-in-law, Marguerite, Blanche and Jeanne, are carrying on illicit affairs. She feels jealous of her sisters-in-law because they are so much happier than she is, as Isabella is married to a gay man who doesn't care for her and is longing for her homeland of France. And because Marguerite, Blanche and Jeanne have formed a clique that excludes her, it's very relatable. Isabella is only 22, homesick, and jealous of the fact her sisters-in-law have boyfriends and love in their lives. Marguerite of Burgundy is a caricature of a coquette, playful and loving one moment and hateful the next. She is interesting reading, and I feel Marguerite of Burgundy is the inspiration for Cersei Lannister. Even though her name lends itself more to Marjorie, I am going to explore that theory in another video. Marguerite and Blanche's orgies, for lack of a better word, in the Tower of Nell are brilliantly described, and you really feel like you're in a castle tower with animal skeletons everywhere and a large fire roaring away, while the Templars burn and scream in the distance. In the same breath, though, I can't help thinking, silly girls, silly spoiled girls, throwing away everything they were born and married into for lust. Louis, the King of Navarre, Marguerite's husband, also known as Louis the Hutin, is odd. His laughing at the Templars' execution, of course, is incredibly inappropriate, but he also laughs at other inappropriate moments, and it's just odd. I know he is naturally cruel, but at this point in the story, it feels like he almost suffers from Tourette's. The book then moves on to a plot involving the Lombard bankers, uncle and nephew, Ptolemy and Guccio Baglione. They're interesting narrative devices, but they are completely fictional, so I don't find them as interesting as the court plot in this book at least. And I find Guccio Baglione a pompous fool who thinks the world owes him success. I really don't like him. Guccio's encounter with the Cressy family is auspicious for the fate of France, but incredibly unlucky for poor Marie de Cressy. She is so young and innocent, and all Guccio sees is a pomegranate ripe for plucking, and the bit where he imagines having her mother, Dame Eliabel, and Marie in bed together is kind of sick when you remember that they owe the Lombards a large sum of money, and does absolutely nothing to warm me to Guccio's character. The puppet scene where Philippe the Iron King and Isabella walk in on Jeanne, Blanche and Marguerite to accuse them of adultery and find them playing with marionettes, recreating a band show depicting a satire of the court's inner workings, is petrifying for the three princesses in a cold way. Real power doesn't have to yell to be scary. As accuser, Isabella holds up rather well, but the moment that breaks her is when her father uses her first name, the first time he has said her first name to her since childhood, and that screams out louder than anything Isabella's craving for parental approval because there is no other loving male presence in her life. Cough, cough, gay husband. Then enter Jeanne and Blanche's mother, Maud of Artois. She is a force of nature, a real sideboard of a woman, and the way she decides straight away to throw her niece Marguerite under the bus to save her daughters is such an obvious thing for any parent to do for their child. The things we do for love. The scene where Maud finds the three princesses being judged, heads shaven on their knees, is so powerful, and it gives you a sense of how fast all this has moved, and it's a striking scene. The best bit of that whole court case, though, is when Marguerite confronts Isabella, saying, "At least I have known pleasure, which is worth all the crowns in the world, and I regret nothing." What a line. I admire Marguerite's spirit, if nothing else. Then the book gets kind of magical with the Templar's curse and Beatrice d'Isson and all that stuff. It kind of loses me. This is a real book about real history, and magic's always hard to slip into real history. It is cleverly done, though, where it's almost the belief in magic that makes it real, not the magic itself. Side note, Beatrice d'Isson was a real person with no magical associations, so I feel kind of bad for her name being dragged into this. It's not like Jaquetta Rivers, who was accused of witchcraft quite a few times during her life and then has a book about witchcraft written by her. So I don't know how I would feel if I died and then somebody wrote a book about me pretending I was a witch. Then there is a plot to get rid of the Lombard bankers, and having the Lombard bankers circumvent the plot by offering the king money while at the same time blackmailing a bishop was very clever, and it reminded me of the old adage about where power actually resides. Does it reside with the crown, the church, or with money? Depends on the man. I still can't stand Guccio Baglioni. He is so shallow. Even his love for Marie is shallow. I just feel sorry for her. Marie is a river that runs deep, and Guccio is a stream. Ptolemy, though, plays everything as cool as a cucumber, and the little thing with his eye, where his bad eye only opens when he's telling the truth. I love that little character flaw, that poker face tell. The scene where King Philippe has a stroke is well written. It's a good hunting scene. I wish he had thought of his children more as he had the stroke instead of his kingdom, but I guess the kingdom is his child at this stage. He's put more time into it. The symbolism in this scene, though, isn't lost on me at all. When Philippe comes across the deer with the branches stuck in its antlers forming a cross, was brilliant, and it was magic well written in actual history, because you can believe in the curse and still see it as an accident, so depending where you stand on magic. Oh, it's just brilliant. So well written. Philippe's death scene is very sad and impersonal. I suppose it's always that way for kings, though, but the final scene where he doesn't even get a moment of peace because he has to teach Louis how to cure the king's evil. What a regimented way to live. It's a really good starting off point, this book, for the whole series, and I do prefer the bits of the book that are written in a POV instead of from third person, and maybe it's because it's translated from French, but there are odd words that stand out for me and I find a little bit jarring. But overall, it's very, very good and well written. The magic fits into the narrative sensibly and is within the realms of possibility, without the fact that the characters are brilliant, and this all took place, so you don't even have to be into fiction to enjoy this. I give this book 8 out of 10 easily. Goodreads gives it 4 out of 5. Today we are reviewing The Strangled Queen by Maurice Druon. The Strangled Queen picks up right where the Iron King left off, but with the imprisoned princesses Marguerite and Blanche. They are obviously extremely excited by King Philippe's death, but no matter how many times I read this book, I find it difficult to believe the rigorous confinement in which these two princesses were kept. They are royal after all. Can anybody out there enlighten me on how Marguerite and Blanche were kept in prison? I think I might have to do some research into this myself to satisfy my own curiosity. Marguerite is offered her freedom if she declares her daughter Little Jan a bastard, but stupidly she decides to play the long game, even though she has no real leverage, and is left in prison alongside Blanche. Then we catch up with King Louis, who is finishing up burying his father, King Philippe, and not really feeling the part of a king, cuckold that he is. Even the weather isn't on his side, and he is soaking wet by the time he gets back from burying his daddy. Louis the Hutin's main preoccupation seems to be getting a new wife. Somehow. Who knows how. He is angry at Marguerite for emasculating him, and this is having a physical effect on him because when he summons his old mistress, Eudeline, he is impotent when he takes her to bed. It is obvious from the get-go that Louis's reign is going to be dominated by his uncle Valois, who is already suggesting new wives for King Louis, and they settle on Clemence of Hungary, Valois' niece. Obviously, once annulment can finally be secured because at present there is no pope. Then there is a lot of political wrangling on the Marigny side against Valois and the Valois side against Marigny, and I'm not going to go into it. It's like a Song of Ice and Fire politics on steroids. And remember guys, this stuff really happened, isn't just made up. The Count of Valois is such an intriguing person. He is Emperor of Constantinople, even though that's only a name, and tried to be King of Aragon. He is the second peer of the realm in France and has been married 3 times and has 13 daughters, and God knows how many sons this man has. He is something of a prodigious legend when it comes to making babies. The book's tone shifts slightly, and we follow Fat Bouville, a counsellor to the king, and Guccio Baglione from the first book, as they go to arrange the wedding of Clemence of Hungary, who lives in Naples. I like Clemence. She's very sweet but naive, and obviously always wants to do the right thing, but is completely wasted on Louis X. After negotiations for the betrothal are finished, Guccio and Bouville go hunting for cardinals. With limited success, they are scattered all over the place, and even though they find Cardinal Duese, there is still no pope, and without a pope there can be no annulment, so Clemence and Louis' engagement is pointless without a pope, as Louis is still married to the imprisoned Marguerite. This whole section of the book is really good because you get to see Clemence of Hungary with her grandmother, Marie, Queen of Naples, and Marie, Queen of Naples, is a force to be reckoned with in the political world. She reminds me of Elena Tyrell from A Song of Ice and Fire. I think she may have been George R. R. Martin's inspiration. Guccio, though, in this section does not endear himself to me at all. He goes about procuring whores for himself and Fat Bouville, but at the same time brags about Marie's love. We then go back to prison with Marguerite and Blanche, and they languish with no news of the outside world. Blanche seems to have gone quite mad because she believed they were about to be freed, and then nothing happened. The two women have obviously fallen out very badly because Marguerite misplayed her hand by not agreeing to Louis' annulment demands immediately. This scene is written so well, describing Blanche's hysteria, especially the description of her eyes as she hammers on the door. You can see the madness lurking beneath the blue in your imagination. Finally convinced she has to do something, Marguerite writes a letter to Louis saying that she will agree to everything. But of course, Marigny makes sure that Louis X never receives that letter. We then flip back to Guccio, who is on his way to visit the Cresse family and his darling Marie, and finds them all starving to death slowly, and Marie is in the worst state of them all. While going about the countryside trying to find them food, Guccio discovers the provost's theft of taxes. And of course, all the provosts are Marigny's creatures. So the bankers team up with Valois and use this information to finally get rid of Marigny. It's an interesting way to wrap up the Marigny plot, especially when you think about the banker's fear of Marigny in the last book when he tried to get rid of them and extorted more money out of them. That came back to bite him on the ass. After Marigny is publicly hung, Louis X discovers that Marigny has been doing everything in his power to delay his annulment and the making of a pope. Valois and Louis take the decision that there should be no more delays, and Louis must immediately become a widower. The scene where Marguerite is strangled in her prison right after they have told her that she can go free is strangely painful, because for a short moment she felt hope. Hope for freedom that she had been denied for over a year. And the scene in the dark room where Marguerite can't see anything and she knows someone is getting closer, but she can't tell what or who it is. Oh, that gave me goosebumps. Then the book ends with Marigny's statue being toppled. Personally, I think the book should have ended with Marguerite's death. That would have been more of a cliffhanger, but personal choice. Louis X rewards the people around him with Marigny's riches, and Valois is floating on air now his old adversary is dead. But the throwaway line that sticks in my head is the bit where Louis rewards the huntsman, the guy who was releasing the doves for him to shoot, when the decision was taken that Marguerite should be killed. The attention to detail here is impressive and akin to something George R. Martin would write. In fact, it's almost an older style of George R. Martin seed planting for future storylines. I give this book 9 out of 10. I prefer it to The Iron King because the characters are now established and the plots are thickening. My only complaint would be that there isn't any Isabella, Queen of England. Goodread gives this book 4.1 out of 5. Today, we are discussing the third book in the Accursed Kings Series, The Poisoned Crown. From the start of The Iron King to the beginning of The Poisoned Crown, it has been about a year and a half, and oh, so much has happened. The book opens with Guccio and Fat Bouville escorting Princess Clemence of Hungary to France to be married from Naples, and there is a big storm where they're all caught up in the boat and the ship is rocking in the waves, and I really enjoyed the dramatic imagery it summoned up. But this section of the story makes me dislike Guccio Baglioni even more, especially the bit when he breaks his leg and concocts that stupid lie about jumping ashore to help Princess Clemence. I think my dislike for Guccio stems from his cockiness, and I think it was this dislike that put me off finishing this series in the first place. I didn't want anything good to happen to him. I clearly remember the first time I tried to read this series thinking Guccio was a fuckboy. In the next chapter, we follow Louis X and his war against Flanders. Louis's army is bogged down in mud and rain with no supplies, and Louis is feeling very disheartened. But I think it's interesting how Maurice Druon used this to explore Louis X's psyche, talking about how his father was so strong-willed and powerful, and how Philip the Fair held on to power so relentlessly it damaged Louis because he never got a chance to test his wings and build confidence in his own right. So, the first chance Louis X gets, he gives up on his war and goes home. In the third chapter, we get Maud back, and she and her lady-in-waiting, Beatrice Dierson, have made a love potion they get Philippe, Count of Poitiers, to drink, so that he will take his wife Jeanne back. But I think Philippe was already leaning in that direction to regain his wife and make an heir. So the magic in this story has been so well written into history, it doesn't matter if it works or not, it's whether you believe in it. And writing about magic well in real history is always a very difficult thing to do. We finally get the wedding of the century, and Louis and Clemence are wed, And if you want any more proof that Louis is the template for Joffrey Baratheon, it's here, man. A live fox jumps out of their wedding cake. Jan, Philippe's wife, is freed from prison after Clemence intercedes for Jan on her wedding day, but that's mainly because she has a crush on Philippe. And then there is a strange scene where Jan, just freed from prison, witnesses a man being buried alive and beheaded for no real reason or point to the story, apart from perhaps to depict the barbarity of the Middle Ages and the hatred between Robert and Maud. When Clemence discovers that her sister-in-law Jan is pregnant, she is sad in a very female way, but I love the way she stood up to Uncle Valois, telling him it's not her fault she's not pregnant. All the women in her family are fertile, and it was good to see a little bit of anger out of this docile, meek woman. The meeting between Clemence and Eudeline was very well written and felt natural, and it really endeared me even more to Clemence, because she was not angry at Eudeline for having born Louis a bastard. She knows that there is nothing wrong with anything Louis did before their marriage. And more than that, she understands that prince is gonna prince. What devastates Clemence is finding out that Louis ordered the murder of Marguerite, his first wife. She is completely horrified, and who wouldn't be horrified at finding out their husband had murdered their previous wife? But the way Clemence goes about confronting Louis is majestically manipulative. I don't know whether Clemence understands that she has power over Louis through religion, but the scene where he is chasing her around the bedroom is great. She makes him feel strong, but still has mastery over him because he's so in love with her, and that is a female art in and of itself. I also get show Marguerite and Joffrey vibes here, / Tommen with all the religious stuff. The fortune teller bit didn't quite hit me right, but the Great Council was a little dull politically until Robert throws his cards on the table. Up until this point, he has been secretly fighting Maud, but now he is out in the open, and may the dice fall where they will. And of course, King Louis sides with Robert. He did murder Marguerite for him after all. Now we are back with the squires of the Cressy family. Guccio's leg has healed, and he is on his way back to take charge of the bank branch of Nerfel. On hearing the news, Marie is overjoyed and lets slip that she hopes to marry Guccio, which her mother, Dame Liabel, and oldest brother are horrified by, that a banker should aim to marry their impoverished noble family. So they start scheming to make sure that Marie's marriage to Guccio never happens. I feel sorry for Marie, but Guccio is such an ass. When he arrives at the manor, he starts telling them how he would improve their home with building works and new furniture. It's enough to make anyone's blood boil. They then inform Guccio that Marie is to marry a distant cousin, and Guccio is so angry he leaves rudely and early. Unluckily, Marie gets a message to Guccio and they meet secretly, and she explains what's going on. Then Guccio rushes back to Paris and his uncle Ptolemy for help, and acts like a dumb cockerel, strutting about, explaining how he plans to kill Marie's new suitor, or he will go to the Queen and get help. Like the Queen would be able to do anything, and why would she take an interest in this lowly banker? Ptolemy luckily stops Guccio doing something very stupid and agrees to help him marry Marie secretly, dispatching Guccio back to Cressy with a monk. Marie and Guccio are married secretly in a church in the manor, but the church door wasn't open, so is the marriage binding? This is the question. Guccio notices this, but fails to tell Marie, simply taking her to bed, even though the marriage might not be recognized. The smarmy little git. Queen Clemence is now pregnant, but Philip of Poitiers has discovered a Templar plot involving cardinals and the conclave to kill Louis X, and that Louis has had a spell cast on him. It's all very dramatic, but doesn't really go anywhere, apart from scary Maud and Beatrice Dearson, as the Templars were involved, and Philippe has their lame Templar who makes poison under guard. They are worried he is going to talk under torture, but the Templar commits suicide, luckily. Maut is still out of favour with the king and refusing to give in to his demands or cede any territory, and the discovery of the Templars forces her to action. After long deliberation, she decides the best thing to do is poison Louis, and finding a means, she goes about it. She decides to poison the sweets that Louis is so fond of that Clemence keeps spread throughout her apartments, and so without much time passing, Louis is taken ill with severe stomach cramps. I don't overly like Maud as a character, but I do admire her tenacity and resourcefulness when it comes to holding on to her lambs. Back with Marie and Guccio and their hidden marriage, Marie discovers that she is pregnant. Just after telling Guccio, her family figure it out, and her brothers take it upon themselves to kill Guccio because they believe there is no marriage and he has dishonoured their little sister. Guccio escapes their clutches and rides back to Paris and his uncle, who informs him the monk that married them is now dead and there is no witness to Guccio and Marie's midnight marriage. Ptolemy then finds Guccio a place to hide. Guccio is such a little wuss. All big talk, but when push comes to shove, he won't protect his woman and goes away to hide like a rat, not thinking at all what will happen to poor Marie. Then Ptolemy tells the brothers Cresse that Guccio has run away to Italy and explains he will sort out everything, and the brothers Cresse go away mollified. The play acting Ptolemy does in this scene is masterful and worthy of an Oscar. Ptolemy is definitely one of my favourite characters. His acting sets him above a lot of the other players on this stage. He is so Italian and dramatic. Louis X dies of poison and passes from this world to the place beyond, leaving an empty throne and a 4-month pregnant Queen Clemence. His uncle Valois makes his grab for power too obvious, and it is shut down by none other than Fat Bouville, who positions himself as the protector of the throne, and I really like this scene. Quite average Bouville, the defender of kings. Philip of Poitiers, King Louis X's brother, and next in line to the succession, if Clemence doesn't have a boy, is in Avignon wrangling cardinals and dealing with Templar plots. So he is out of Paris and of no use to Maud. She worries she has played her hand too soon, as Maud and Louis Count of Evreux are the only people against Valois being regent, and Valois is a big champion of Robert of Artois. In the end, nothing is decided, and they decide to hold a great council calling every member of the family. The book ends with 3 riders heading out in directions to summon the family, one of which being Guccio Baglione, who is sent to Avignon to get Philip of Poitiers, with a message from Fat Bouville. I give The Poisoned Crown 9 out of 10. I really enjoyed this book. The story is really heating up, and the seeds sown in the first 2 books are now ready for harvest, and the storm is gathering. The Poisoned Crown gets 4.2% on Goodread. Today, we are reviewing The Royal Succession by Maurice Druon, the 4th book in the Accursed Kings series. The book opens straight after the death of Louis X, with no heir in between. Everybody is vying for power. The regency is up for grabs as Queen Clemence is only 4 months pregnant. Valois, her uncle, and the uncle of the deceased King Louis, is trying to bully Queen Clemence into accepting him as regent and forcing her to move back to Paris, so he can have all the trappings of a regent while she is pregnant, before anyone else can make a move. He plans on presenting the dead king's brother Philippe with a fait accompli. Meanwhile, Guccio arrives with Cardinal Duese seeking sanctuary in Lyon. He announces the death of King Louis X to the cardinal, at which point Duese immediately goes to tell Philippe his brother, the king, is dead, at which point Philippe closes the gates of the city of Lyon. not allowing any other messengers to arrive, then declares himself regent. He knows Valois is his main opponent for the regency, but there is also going to be the Count of Burgundy to deal with. This book feels as if it could have been written by George R.R. Martin. It is so A Song of Ice and Fire or House of the Dragon. You can definitely see where George R.R. Martin got a lot of his inspiration. This is the book that on my first read through I lost interest in this series because there is so much time dedicated to the cardinals trying to decide who should be pope during the conclave, and I just didn't find that as interesting as the French court. However, the conclave does have its funny moments. The scene where the cardinals are bricked up inside the church to force them to decide on a pope through starvation and deprivation is such a good, funny scene. And then Cardinal Duese dissembling and acting very feeble is such a great political move on his part, and it reminds me of a certain George R.R. Martin character, Maester Pycelle. I'm going to be making a Maester Pycelle Cardinal Duese comparison video, so keep an eye out for that in the coming weeks. The book then shifts back to Marie de Cressy, who is taken by her family from Cressy and left with Ptolemy in Paris, who arranges for her to enter a convent to wait for Guccio. She is very happy to know that Guccio is not dead or in prison, but that is all she knows about him, and you can tell that convent life is going to be very hard for this pregnant teen. Meanwhile, after breaking up the cardinals, Philippe has been moving fast and has taken control of all the important parts of the realm. He then presents his uncle Valois and little brother Charles with a fait accompli. Having already declared himself regent, he has outmaneuvered the older Valois. The scene where Philippe asks Valois for the keys to the treasury is masterful, and you can definitely see how the political wrangling in this book inspired George R. R. Martin. There are big moves being made just with words, so follow them closely. Now officially regent, Philippe starts fretting about Queen Clemence maybe having a boy, but that is the least of his problems, as at least he would still be regent until the boy comes of age. The problem is what should happen if Clemence has a girl, because dead King Louis already has a daughter, Jeanne, from his first marriage, though she could be illegitimate due to her mother's infidelity. She has never been declared illegitimate, though, or a bastard, so Philippe has to go about trying to prove that women are unfit to rule. Of course, this goes down very badly with his mother-in-law, Mahout, who runs her own county. Just think, isn't this the plot to House of the Dragon? Bastard children who are obviously illegitimate with claims to the throne, and the idea of women's right to rule? Tell me if I'm wrong. I'm making a video about it, so check that out. Subscribe. It's coming out in a couple of weeks, just after the premiere of House of the Dragon. I don't know why, but this book doesn't grab me in the same way the first 3 books did. It was the same the first time I read this book through, and I'm feeling it again now. I don't know what's lacking, but it's lacking something. The Great Council scenes were very amusing. I really enjoyed the last living son of St. Louis, who was completely mad and thought he was at a tourney. I kept giggling when I was listening to that on my headphones, walking around. Robert of Artois really holds his own during this entire segment, and the passage where it is described that Robert of Artois is on nobody's side but his own was great. And of course, Robert immediately jumps on the bandwagon that women can't be allowed to inherit or rule because he wants to get his county back from his Aunt Mahout, and this is just what she feared and was trying to get Philip to stop from happening. Philippe, as regent, is playing a dangerous game, trying to make sure the Burgundians support him, even though Burgundy has its own horse in the game. They have Marguerite's maybe bastard daughter Jeanne, the Duke of Burgundy's niece. Philippe keeps saying that if Clemence has a girl, of course Jeanne will inherit when she comes of age, but anyone with any sense can see that this is never going to happen. Philippe is lucky though, because the Duke of Burgundy is actually quite dumb and believes all of his noble proclamations about inheritance, even agreeing to be betrothed to Philippe's oldest daughter, who is only 8. Robert of Artois then goes on a rampage through Maout's lands, taking castles, and uncovers some evidence that Maout poisoned King Louis X of France. Meanwhile, back in Paris, Philippe the Regent is trying to contain Robert of Artois' rampage, telling Maout, his mother-in-law, that she is going to have to make some concessions if she wants peace, at which point Maout, completely enraged, throws the fact that she poisoned his brother, King Louis X, back in Philippe's face, telling Philippe that she poisoned King Louis for him. Philippe is horrified, but pragmatic enough to understand that if this were to ever come to light, it will fall on his head and people will think he ordered it, so that he could claim the crown. While all this is going on in Paris, Cardinal Douaize is elected Pope because he managed to dissemble enough to convince all the other cardinals locked up with him that he was dying. Of course, he is in the best of health and remarkably makes a recovery as soon as he is crowned Pope John the 22nd. He immediately gets his brother ennobled by the regent Philippe and puts his family in a position of power. Douaize and the regent Philippe now have a strong alliance that was built on the closing of the gates of Lyon. That fateful morning when the gates of Lyon were closed, they made a pope and a king. Pope John, because of his alliance with Philippe, writes a letter to the traitor Robert of Artois demanding that he surrender Artois and himself to the regent Philippe. Robert of Artois decides to surrender but not disband his army, feeling that he has an ace up his sleeve because he has found the witch who made the poison Maout used to kill King Louis X. But Philippe, the smartest man in the room, even compared to Robert, manages to outthink him and outfox him, throwing Robert in prison until all the castles and lands that Robert took in Artois are surrendered and his army disbanded. Robert of Artois is enraged at being outthought for once. Queen Clemence finally has her baby, which is a boy, and they call him John I. But the labour was not easy. Forceps had to be used, and they are now lacking a wet nurse. So Marie de Cressy is summoned from her convent to be wet nurse to the king. She has just given birth to a healthy baby boy, also named John. During King John's christening, he has a seizure after being dunked into the freezing water of the font. The rumours about Maout being a poisoner have been swirling about the court, and Bouville, worried that Maout, the king's godmother, attempted to poison him at the christening, causing the seizure, does a baby swap with Marie's little John. This goes ahead when the king is presented for the first time to the barons, but this time Maout actually does try to poison the king and is successful in this poisoning attempt. Poor little John Baglioni dies not even a month old after vomiting over the regent Philippe. Philippe, of course, goes straight ahead and declares himself King of France, never doubting for a second that the baby that died in his arms was not the real King John of France. It's interesting here to speculate whether Philippe knew what his mother-in-law was up to. Philippe does hint him out, but he does it in such an open manner that it could be taken either way, and even Maout herself wonders what game Philippe is playing, keeping his hands so clean and not knowing for sure whether the baby was poisoned. But Maud has decided it was all worth the risk. Poisoning 2 kings was definitely worth what it took to make her daughter Jeanne queen. When Fede Bouville tells Marie that her baby is dead and she must now care for the real King of France but keep him hidden, she is understandably devastated. She is sent back to her convent, but a few days later, Lady Bouville turns up and bullies Marie with fears of hell to renounce Guccio and go back to Cressy with her brothers and the real King of France to live in obscurity, with a pension promised, of course. Marie is forced to write a letter dictated by Lady Bouville, and when Guccio gets the letter from Marie saying that she doesn't love him anymore and that she is going back to Cressy because she is ashamed of what she has done, he acts like a spoiled child, raging around and then going to get drunk with Robert Artois, newly released from jail. They go to a brothel where Guccio has sex with a whore and then he slaps her after taking her to bed. And I cannot stand Guccio Baglione. He is just horrible. Why did Marie ever fall in love with him? Robert of Artois, now released from prison less than a day, is starting to plot against Maud all over again. In the interim, Philippe has declared himself King of France. However, the Duke of Burgundy is not happy about this, believing his niece Jeanne, Louis X's daughter of questionable legitimacy, should be queen, and this is when Philippe starts looking for ancient French laws and customs that say women can't inherit, discovering the obscure, not well known Salic law. Because of Burgundy, Philippe is anxious to get his coronation over with and ends up having to bribe his uncle Valois to support him. The grounds of his kingship are that shaky, and he knows that Maud has had 2 kings killed on his behalf and is terrified anyone is going to uncover this. When his younger brother, Charles de la Marche, escapes the coronation by climbing over a wall and ends up stuck in a marsh, that was really funny. I laughed. Then, at the actual crowning ceremony, the old Duchess Agnes speaking out about how women do have a right to rule was epic, even if nobody paid her any attention whatsoever. I give this book 7 out of 10. I don't think it's quite as good as the previous 3 books. The best bit of it was definitely little King John dying, or was it King John? The rest of the book was super political and not really my thing. Could have done with a bit more drama to spice it up. Goodread gives this book 4.2 out of 5 on Goodread. Today we are reviewing The She-Wolf by Maurice Druon. I know it's been a minute since we reviewed any of the Accursed Kings series because we've been focusing on House of the Dragon, but here we are back in business. So, why not get started? During my first read-through of this series, this is the book where I lost interest because you skip over the whole reign of Philip the Long and pick up 6 years later from where the last book left off in England, not France, with the escape of Roger Mortimer from the Tower of London. The escape is a very good, tense read, and then you move along to the court of Edward II, where Edward is informing his wife Isabella of Mortimer's escape, even though she already knows because she helped organize his escape. There is a lot of back and forth between them, and Isabella gives as good as she gets. This is the first time in this series you get to meet Edward II up close, and even though he is hateful to his wife and royal to the point of stupidity, he isn't unintelligent, just very socially unaware, in my opinion. Edward II's blatant homosexuality seems to be the root cause of most of his court's dislike for him, as well as his spoiling of his lover, Hugh Despenser, as well as his entire family. The Despensers are greedy, and you see that very early on. They are taking off the Queen's plate, and because they are taking off Isabella's plate, this is angering her son, Prince Edward, who is turning to his mother's side. What follows is chapter upon chapter of Roger Mortimer's exile in France. He meets up with good old Ptolemy, our favourite banker, who introduces him to Robert of Artois, who is one of his cousins, and Ptolemy grants Roger a loan so he can live in France. Roger is then introduced to Valois by Robert of Artois, and they all cook up a plot to ferment rebellion in Aquitaine, trying to get Edward II to declare war on France. Valois is basically running France at this point for Charles the Fair, who is now king, because he is useless and more concerned about his new wife than anything else. He keeps getting introduced to Roger Mortimer and then cannot remember a single thing about him, which of course is angering Mr. Mortimer. Over a year passes, but they finally ride out for Aquitaine, because the English have finally arrived to defend their lands from French incursions. It's all very male, if you get my meaning. I can see why I lost interest in this series the first time around I tried to read it. There are lots of descriptions of horses and pretty armour and swords. There is also no Marine Guccio, no plotting poisonous Maut. All the characters we have grown attached to in the first 4 books haven't turned up yet. Valois sets out for Aquitaine and starts besieging Edmund, Earl of Kent, the King of England's half-brother. Edmund is the King of England's representative in France, but Edmund's back is up against the wall because his backup never arrives from England and he ends up having to surrender to his uncle, Valois. It's all a bit incestuous. Edmund's mother is Valois and Philip the Fair's sister. Edmund has a long conversation with Roger Mortimer during the surrender negotiations, and Edmund decides that the dispensers are the reason his backup never arrived from England, and believes himself now safer as a French hostage than going back to England defeated. This really showcases the powers the dispensers wield under Edward II, because a prince of the blood should not be scared for his life. This is where we really get into the incestuous family bush that is the royal family of England and the royal family of France. Philip the Fair's sister, Marguerite, was the second wife of Edward I of England, and they had 2 sons, Kent and Norfolk, who are half French. Valois is their uncle. King Charles of France is their first cousin, making Isabella, Queen of England, their first cousin as well as their sister-in-law. Then we get back to Fat Bouville, who we haven't seen for a while, who is yet again back at the papal court of Avignon, trying to convince the Pope to give Valois the money owed for the impending crusade that everyone now knows at this point is never going to happen. In the end, the Pope, wily old Cardinal Dueze who was, pays off Valois to get him to give up the notion of this ridiculous crusade. This is the only means of really dealing with Valois at this point, because he's always broke. It's really nice seeing 2 characters from the previous books interact. It is the first time in this book we have seen it so far. Dueze starts asking about Guccio because he liked Guccio, and Marie and whatever happened to their marriage, and my interest peaks. Fat Bouville ends up spilling his guts about everything that went wrong with little King John and Marie's baby John, and that the real King of France is hiding out in a manor somewhere with his foster mother, and only Fat Bouville and Marie know the truth because Bouville's wife is now dead. And now the Pope knows, that wily old fox Dueze. Of course, he is trying to spin this new knowledge to his advantage in any way he can. Now, Isabella, Queen of England, arrives in France to negotiate the treaty over Aquitaine, but she is really here to get away from her abusive husband and his lover. Isabella immediately takes up with Roger Mortimer. They form a blood brother pact, going to bed straight after that. It's very intense reading, and very intense behaviour for people who only had a casual acquaintance before now, but it makes sense as both these people have been under an immense amount of pressure. King Charles's interactions with his sister Isabella seem a bit off compared to what we know of him from earlier books. He seems extremely stupid. I always thought if any of the cafe boys were stupid, it was Louis the Hutin. But Charles seems almost simple-minded, asking Roger Mortimer the same question over and over, and his complete preoccupation with needing a son, his still blaming Isabella for his first wife Blanche's infidelity, is all a bit much. Isabella and Roger have a very intense love affair. It's kind of first love intense, at least for Isabella. Then we have Valois' slow decline into death, and I found it very sad reading and extremely scary. It was well written. The idea of being paralysed by a stroke and the fear of the endless void, the fact that Valois finds no comfort in his family was extremely upsetting to me, especially the bit where his family only perk up at his deathbed when he starts making bequests in his will. Robert of Artois takes place as first counsellor after Valois' death and continues to support Queen Isabella as she starts planning to raise troops to invade England with money from the Lombard bankers. It's interesting here to see how the Lombards support Isabella because Edward II owes them so much money and he's refusing to pay. This is classic Iron Bank if I ever seen it. Maud, of course, is completely against Robert of Artois' influence on the king, so starts intriguing with the English against Isabella, telling Edward II about Isabella's ongoing affair with Roger Mortimer, which forces Edward II to write letters to King Charles demanding his wife back, and after months of consistent letter writing and Maud's persuasion, using the death of her daughter Blanche, Charles's first wife, as leverage, Charles decides that his sister, Isabella, Queen of England, must leave France and return to her husband. There is also the fact that King Charles has never forgiven his sister Isabella for her part in bringing to light the infidelity of his first wife Blanche, and of course now Isabella looks like a hypocrite because she has been unfaithful herself. Robert of Artois alerts Isabella and Mortimer to King Charles's plot to send them back to England to face judgment, and they safely escape to Belgium. Meanwhile, in the background of these great events, Guccio is back in France and goes about collecting his son from Marie. Marie is still suffering from PTSD and fear and refuses to see Guccio, so he takes his 9-year-old son away. The son, of course, is actually the real King John of France. This leaves Marie completely bereft and still longing to see Guccio. The scene in Paris when Guccio introduces his son, Giannino, to Queen Clemence, and Clemence doesn't know that this boy is her actual son, was painful reading. Then we have the conquest of England, which is long to read about until we get to the executions. The execution of Hugh Despenser the Younger was gruesome in extreme detail, but I couldn't put the book down, and the delight Isabella took in watching her husband's lover mutilated really soured the high moral ground she liked standing on, especially the sexual satisfaction she seemed to get out of it. It even disturbed Mortimer. I really like Isabella's son, Edward III. He is a sensible little guy and more like his grandfather, the Iron King, than any of his other relatives. His refusal to claim the crown without his father's formal abdication, if not sentimental, was morally right. The bit in the book where the 3 jailers shave Edward II's head in between moves from prison was needlessly cruel and actually really upset me, because we only ever hear about Edward's cruelty off-page, so that got me wondering how much of it was him and how much of it was actually the Despensers manipulating him. Then there is Isabella's hesitation to have Edward II killed, and thinking back over her life with him, it wasn't all bad. She loved her coronation and being queen. The birth of their children was special, and above anything else, she wanted to love him. I feel as if Isabella was bullied into having Edward killed by Roger Mortimer. The scene where he threatens to leave her because he is jealous of Edward storming off to manipulate her makes me despise Mortimer as a small man. Then there is the fact that Mortimer obviously knows about the cruelty being inflicted on Edward II while in captivity, the lack of food, being made to sleep beside a dry well filled with rotten meat. You've got to remember that Edward II pardoned Mortimer from death after he committed treason, so he is kinder than his own captor now. Then there is the fact Edward II wants to join a monastery because he knows he was a bad king and wants to repent. The whole thing really makes me pity Edward and his utter fear when he is brought into the nice room, knowing they are going to kill him in there for sure. And the red-hot poker up his ass made me feel sick, and then want to have a shower. The description of it was utterly horrific and so cruel and disgusting. They were mocking him for his sexuality. It's just horrible. Just ugh. But it was probably quite historically accurate. I give this book 7 out of 10. Some bits I enjoyed much more than others. The time jump was a little bit jarring, and I never thought I would say this, but there wasn't enough Marie and Guccio drama. I also thought there wasn't enough Isabella and Edward POVs, and a lot of the stuff is written in the third person, when I would have preferred it to be written in a POV. But I think that is my own personal preference when it comes to storytelling. Goodread gives this book 4.1 out of 5. Hello and welcome to Jessie Bear Book Club. Today we are talking about The Lily and the Lion, one of the final books in Maurice Druon's Accursed Kings Series. This book opens with the marriage of Edward III to Philip of Hainaut and the sad realization of Isabella that she is no longer the queen, only the queen mother, and that dealing with Mortimer's constant jealousy is draining mentally, and it's costing her public opinion. Even though she loves Mortimer dearly, she can see his faults, but she is busy dreaming of France, because her brother King Charles is dying, and she hopes to inherit his crown because he still hasn't fathered a son. While King Charles lies dying in his sickbed, Robert of Artois is busy trying to secure the regency for Philip of Valois, Charles's cousin, because Charles's wife is pregnant, and it could be a boy. They're worried they're looking at another King John the Posthumous situation. But luckily for Philip of Valois, now Philip VI of France, it's a girl. However, England have sent a bishop to argue the case of Queen Isabella becoming Queen of France in her own right because she is the last remaining child of Philip the Fair. But when the Salic law is invoked, and it is obvious to everyone that Isabella can't rule France, the bishop then puts forward the idea of Edward, King of England, her son and the grandson of Philip the Fair, becoming the ruler of France, and that goes down like a lead balloon. So all hail Philip VI, the first Valois king. Could you imagine if Charles of Valois could see his son now? He would be smiling ear to ear. I like the description of Philip VI as the makeshift king. He looks like a king, he's tall, he's handsome, he's very good in tourneys, he has a booming voice. He looks just like you would imagine a medieval king should look, but he is not overly intelligent. But as long as he has good ministers around him, that shouldn't be a problem, should it? Of course, Philip's main advisor is Robert of Artois, his cousin, who is still trying to fight his aunt Maud to get his county back. When the documents Robert is looking for that would prove he owned Artois go missing, he decides he will forge the documents because Maud will never be able to admit in court that she had the originals destroyed. And how could anything go wrong for Robert? He has the support of the new makeshift King Philip. In the background of this all going on, King Edward of England arrives at the biggest tourney ever held to render homage for his lands in France to his cousin, the new King Philip the Makeshift. I really like sensible young Edward. I love the line about how a child from a disordered home claims calm themselves as they reach independence. Edward is only 16, but very sensible. Now the book follows Robert of Artois as he goes around trying to reproduce the fake documents. In the middle of his attempts to produce the forgeries, Robert goes around to try and prove Maud destroyed the originals, and we get to see Fat Bouville again. He is old and nearly blind and very lonely, and it makes me incredibly sad. I wanted to cry when I was reading this, and he always wanted to do the right thing, Fat Bouville, even if it never went to plan. Robert gets all his evidence and creates his forgeries with the help of his wife, only for them to be read out for the first time in public and for the dates to be wrong by 30 years. This actually made me laugh out loud on my plane while I was reading this part of the book. For this one small thing to be wrong, it's cataclysmic. It points directly at Robert that these are forgeries. And to be honest, it's the sort of thing I would get wrong, so I found it hilarious. Enter Beatrice Dearson, who has decided no longer to side with Maut. Beatrice is restless in Maut's household as Maut is growing old, and this felt very human. Beatrice and Robert of Artois have an affair, and this has been building since book 1, so I am glad we finally got some sexy time with these two. I've also enjoyed seeing inside Beatrice's head, especially when it came to her worshipping the devil and the dark arts, because Beatrice has always intrigued me, and we finally get evidence of her magical practices. Beatrice decides to poison Maut because she has her eyes on becoming Robert of Artois' wife, even though he's already married to the king's sister. This seemed very unrealistic. Beatrice was overestimating Robert of Artois' love for her by spades loads. This scene where Beatrice poisons Maut after Maut banquets with the king was deliciously evil. Her nursing of Maut as she grew iller and iller reminded me of whatever happened to baby Jane, especially the bit right at the end where Beatrice whispers in the dying woman's ear that she has poisoned her patroness for love of her greatest enemy. Beatrice's immense disappointment that Robert of Artois doesn't make her a maid in his wife's service immediately seems realistic to us, the reader, but to Beatrice this is a crushing blow. Beatrice then takes service with the new Countess of Artois, Maut's daughter Jeanne, the widow, only for Jeanne to become mysteriously ill and die within a month of her mother. The book then moves back to England, and the plot Mortimer cooks up to deceive the Earl of Kent and trap him in treason is so cruel. I liked the Earl of Kent. He was a little bit dim, but kind, and Edward's growing resentment of Mortimer comes from this moment on, especially as his uncle of Kent was executed without the king's knowledge. Edward's complete horror when he realizes Mortimer has gotten his mother, the Queen Dowager, pregnant outside marriage feels very realistic for the Middle Ages, and now Isabella, former Queen of England, Queen Dowager, Queen Mother, is nothing but a silly whore in her son King Edward III's eyes. This scene where Edward breaks down the door to arrest Mortimer in his mother, the Queen's chamber, and Isabella is barefoot in her nightdress, pregnant and crying, and all Edward can think is Mortimer has brought his most royal mother to this, is very childlike and adult at the same time. If you are a child of divorce, you probably know what I'm talking about. Mortimer's reincarceration in the tower has great callbacks to the beginning of the She-Wolf, but this time Mortimer's hope of escape is dead before he is. I kind of wish, because this book is fictionalized, that Isabella had been present for Mortimer's execution, but I understand in actual history she wasn't there, and Druon wanted to be true to some world events. Back to France. Robert and Beatrice's affair has lost its spark, and Beatrice is realizing that Robert is never going to keep any of his promises to her, and that she cannot trap him with the love potions or a baby. Robert's case to get his county back from the Duchess of Burgundy, Maut's granddaughter, is going very badly, and Beatrice, annoyed at Robert, decides to be vengeful and tell the Burgundian court that Robert has been forging seals in his documents. Robert's accomplice, La Divion, is arrested by the king's men, but when Robert goes to the king to get her released, the king knows nothing of it, and they discover his wife, Queen Jeanne, the Lame of Burgundy, has taken his seal. The scene where King Philippe beats his wife Jeanne for the theft and use of his private seal is shocking, because up until this point in the story there had been nothing but love between them, and Queen Jeanne finally confesses to hating Robert of Artois with a vengeance because he was involved in the downfall of her sister Marguerite in Book 1 and 2. Robert knows who has sown the seeds of all of this, so he has Beatrice murdered and framed as a witch. Well, because she is one, and it's a fitting end for Beatrice. She was very interesting, but horrible. She had at least 6 people killed that we know about. But Robert's revenge is for nothing, as La Divion has confessed to forging all the seals, and Robert is hoping that playing dumb will save him. Then there is the great tourney hosted by King Philip and the King of Bohemia, and I love the description of the massive festival of arms. I especially loved the bit where ladies were ripping the sleeves off their gowns as favours for their special gallant knights because they wanted to show off their shapely arms. Robert of Artois is there, of course, avoiding the King of France and insulting Burgundy every chance he gets. I especially loved the bit where Queen Jeanne of Burgundy tries to touch Robert of Artois' helmet to shame him, as a lady touching a man's helmet means he is a liar in the courtly love game. Ooh, how devilish. I'm a big courtly love nerd. I found this incredibly titillating. King Philip warns Robert of Artois privately to stop persisting that the documents he has are real, because they have been proven to be fakes. Robert, however, continues to insist that all the seals attached to these forged documents are real, sealing his fate, because now he will be accused publicly of forgery and perjury. Robert is incredibly angry that King Philip won't lie for him, as he believes Philip would not have the throne of France if he, Robert, had not stepped in to seize it for him. He sees Philip as weak. Philip, however, is a man of honour, and even though he loves Robert as a cousin and a brother-in-law, he knows that Robert's case to retain Artois is completely lost and steeped in sinister dealings. I really like the fact that this conversation between these two very powerful men, who are so similar, takes place while they are both in the bath at their most vulnerable. Princes of the blood arguing about something so serious while completely nude is so absurd it is almost believable. It also reminded me of gangster movies when they're having a steam and discussing all their dirty dealings. Then good old Ptolemy turns up again, and he is dying, but as a final act of defiance against the French throne, as the throne are expelling and crippling all Lombard trade, he acts as a bank for Robert of Artois so he can flee France for England before his trial as a forger begins. Reading Robert's trial, you get a real sense of the fact he has spent the last 40 years in vain trying to get his county back, using all the means at his disposal, legal and illegal. La Divion is even burnt alive because of her compliance in his crimes, and his children and wife are in jail because he, Robert, ran away from justice. Despite all of this, however, Robert is still strangely likable in his escapades, travelling around Europe getting kicked out of every kingdom and county, because the King of France keeps writing letters telling everyone that he doesn't like his cousin Robert anymore. His escapades are extremely amusing to read, especially when Robert starts using magic to assassinate the King of France and his councillors, and then becomes incredibly despondent when the magic assassination doesn't work. I see a little bit of Beatrice's influence in that. Robert eventually goes to England and starts fermenting ideas in Edward III's head that he is actually the rightful King of France through the direct line, and to be honest, Robert's not wrong. But Robert then becomes irritated at how long Edward is taking to get things moving to mount his campaign. Back in France, Philip VI is laughing at the idea of Edward III of England trying to claim the crown of France, and he is aware that Robert of Artois is manipulating the young Edward. Philip is also aware that for a long time Robert was manipulating him. Robert Artois has been running the same manipulation game for years on different people and has now simply changed his focus from Philippe to Edward. The book at this point has moved forward in time 9 to 10 years, and I am enjoying it, but it is not the same as the early books. I don't have the same connection to the characters as I did when reading the first 3 books, as all the characters we got connected to are now dead. Robert of Artois finally manages to shame Edward III into going to war with France, and the scene Robert does with the heron and all the people announcing their weird oaths to go to war was brilliant. However, my favourite bit was finding out that Edward III has been corrupted slightly by age and is looking to take a mistress, as his beloved Philippa is pregnant again with their 3rd child. What follows is a list of the English campaign in France up to Robert of Artois' death at a siege where he takes a crossbow bolt in the leg and dies of wound fever on his way back to England. I felt cheated by Robert of Artois' death. We had Mahout get her comeuppance. We had Beatrice Ladisson get her comeuppance. We even had Louis the Hutin die horribly, but Robert dies looking at the stars. And we didn't get any POVs of his dying moments, apart from him yelling in his fevered state like he was trying to win a court case. I felt let down by this. Robert has been our main character since book 1, so I felt they did him dirty. He should have had a more horrific death, because he was a pretty bad guy, even though I liked him. But I suppose Maurice Druon was trying to be historically accurate in some way. The main story of the book kinda ends there, and we get an epilogue which jumps forward 14 years, which follows Giannino Baglioni as he finds out the origins of his birth. And again, I felt cheated. We didn't get to see Guccio die, and he is one of the characters I really would have liked to have seen die, as he wasn't a nice person at all. And we never get to see Marie again, and that made me sad because Marie had such an unhappy life. It's odd how this small piece of information about his birth completely ruins Giannino's life because he decides to embrace the fact that he is a prince of France and spends the end of his life as a pretender to the French throne, trying in vain to get anyone to support him, and he ends up dying in prison. I get the distinct impression that this book was meant to be the last in the series, but we still have The King Without a Kingdom to go. But that was written 17 years after the original series, so how well it's going to fit in is up to anyone's guess. I give The Lily and the Lion a solid 7 out of 10. It's a good tie-up book. It closes off a lot of the through threads from book 1, especially the Templar's Curse, Robert and Mahout's feud, Isabella and Mortimer. Even if I did feel let down by Robert of Artois' death, it wraps up the Lombard plot. I also missed the characters from book 1, and there is a lot of time jumps in this book compared with the others, which was a little disconcerting, but I guess I can live with it. Today we are reviewing the final book in the Accursed Kings series, and I was super excited to start this book. I had never read it before, and I had my hopes really, really high. For A King Without a Kingdom, even the name sounds brilliant, but I found myself bitterly disappointed by the fact this entire book is narrated in the third person by a traveling cardinal we have never met before. When the book started off in this style, I thought it was simply going to be a prologue, a sort of George R. Martin thing, where the guy dies at the end. But after getting a quarter of the way through this book, and not finding any change in the writing style, I felt incredibly let down. After investing so much time and effort in this series, this choice of a third-person style is such a cop-out, lack of effort decision on Maurice Druon's part. This amazing story about a great dynasty deserves a better ending than this third-person narrative final book. I know that this book was written about 10 years after The Lily and the Lion, but that doesn't make up for the fact that it feels like a completely different series. We also skip forward massively in time, so it's hard to connect with any of these third-person narrated characters that we haven't even met. I think it would be slightly different if it was narrated closer to when we finished The Lily and the Lion instead of 20 odd years on. The book also covers a large segment of time, maybe 10 or 8 years, so you're reading it and it's all going very, very quickly, whereas the first books take place over 10 years. So the style choice is jarring and the pacing is completely off. There are interesting segments to this book. I enjoyed learning about Charles the Bad, King of Navarre, Marguerite's grandson. Charles causing havoc in France is the best revenge for what happened to his grandmother Marguerite, and his punishment once he is caught. Being imprisoned in Chateau Gaillard like his grandmother was so perfectly cruel. It tormented him mentally, and all the different punishments the king thought up for him, like having him tied in a rope so he thinks he's going to be thrown in the river, having chains brought in. Just the mental manipulation in that is medieval mind games taken to the next level. Blocking up the chimney so his room fills with smoke and he can't breathe. Who's thinking these up, Maurice Druon? You obviously have a twisted side. I know he's dead, but still. I also really enjoyed seeing John of Artois, Robert of Artois' oldest son, who looks so much like his giant of a father, but unfortunately doesn't have his brain. It was also good to hear what happened to his family, how they were kept in prison after he rebelled against the king, went into exile, joined the English, and what happened to his wife and children. There are consequences for everything, even if he didn't get to see them himself. Because Robert of Artois really was the main protagonist in the first 5 books. Him and maybe Isabella and Guccio and Marie. But apart from these 2 segments, the book mainly focuses on John II's inept military campaigns, and that bores me to tears. If I had to hear anything else about his bombards, or his sieges, or the Order of the Star, I was just like, let's get this book over with at this point. Not only is A King Without a Kingdom a bad ending to the Accursed Kings series, but it has also given me the fear that A Winds of Winter and A Dream of Spring might follow similar paths, especially A Dream of Spring, as we've already had segments from The Winds of Winter, but it would follow the same pattern. A large amount of time passes, and then the final book in a beloved series covers a large amount of time based in a third-person narrative to make it easier for the author. I am now terrified George R. Martin, who was inspired to write A Song of Ice and Fire by the Accursed Kings series, is going to follow a similar path. Does anybody else share these fears? Please let me know, because I'm reeling from figuring this out. A King Without a Kingdom, as a story and a book, had so much potential, and I felt let down by Maurice Druon's cop-out choice. I give this book 3 out of 10, and Goodreads gives it 3.4 stars out of 5, which I think is overly generous. But what do you think? Leave a comment. I have heard a lot on some of the forums I'm on and some of the Facebook groups I am part of that many people have been let down by A King Without a Kingdom, because I've been posting about the other content I've been making about the earlier books in this series, and I keep getting the same one. The last book's terrible. The last book's terrible. So has anybody else felt the same way? Remember to subscribe to this channel, because I have multiple playlists about the Accursed Kings series where I compare characters from the Accursed Kings series to A Song of Ice and Fire characters. I also cover House of the Dragon in great detail, and I have a video coming out very soon where I will be ranking all the Accursed King books from best to worst. So make sure and subscribe so you don't miss that. Also like this video so Edward III doesn't invade my house and decide to make himself king of it. Until next time, everybody, goodbye. Do not do anything silly and get banished like Robert of Artois. Until next time, bye.